Piñas Adventures Number 2, by Mark Lopez. Piña the chicken was having a very hard time getting herself back up into the living room where the others were gathering. Her little legs had given up on carrying her. As if to make matters worse, it had become much hotter inside than outside. Piña had been walking around, trying to find a place where the heat hadn't made it so unbearable. It had gotten so bad that all that she could do was cuddle close under Mark's blanket. But then, her stomach rumbled loudly and there didn't seem to be anywhere for it to go to. She looked at Mark worriedly and tilted her head a little to the side in question. Mark smiled down at her as he ran a hand through her feathery breast feathers. "I think you're hungry. Do you want a treat? How about I call my mum and dad? Then I'll bring you right back to your nest." Okay, Piña gave him a little nod. She wasn't quite sure what a treat was, but she trusted him enough to let him know if something didn't taste right. Piña knew that Mark was a very good cook when it came to food, so it would probably take no more than 5 minutes for her to get whatever Mark brought home. She was just going to have to wait for him. After Mark left to get their parents, Piña went looking around for other sheltering places. She found a small area near the kitchen window, which was covered by a curtain. She pulled it aside and got out on the windowsill to inspect the place better. She had only walked around halfway around when she heard the doorbell ringing outside. Her heart began pounding in excitement as she turned back towards the noise, hoping that Mark would bring her some food. But to her disappointment, it appeared that he wouldn't be coming home until later. The sound of another bell came from downstairs, followed immediately by someone calling Mark's name. Mark was not home yet. Piña didn't like this, but there wasn't much she could do. If Mark didn't come home, maybe his family would. They always fed her after the fact, even if she'd already done a good job. Piña decided to go see who it was. She hopped off the windowsill and trotted carefully towards the front door. When she reached the hallway mirror, she stretched up on her tiptoes and peered around the edge of the frame to try to see who was at the door. It looked like a girl, with short dark hair and bright blue eyes, dressed in an incredibly revealing pink skirt that went up to her knees. Piña couldn't help but be impressed by the dress. After all, it was one of the things that was popular during these days. The girl's mouth was set into a frown as she tried to open the front door. The hinges weren't working very well and it seemed as if they would give way any second now. Piña was ready to jump away from the window and hide under the couch until Mark returned with food, when suddenly, the girl stepped backwards, bumping into the doorframe and causing the handle to swing violently towards the ceiling. This caught Piña completely off guard, and before she realized what was happening, she was flying straight up in the air. Piña yelped loudly as she landed on the ground below with a loud thud and rolled a few times. Once she had finally stopped moving, the last thing Piña saw was the girl's horrified face staring up at her from behind the door. Piña stared up at her for a moment, trying to figure out why such an attractive, kind-looking woman was so scared and shocked. Suddenly, the door flew open, hitting Piña full force in the face, causing her to fall forward onto the floor, unconscious. The rest of the day passed quickly, and the next thing Piña knew, she was laying on a bed with bandages wrapped tightly around her neck and head, her wings slightly bent out of shape, and Mark kneeling beside her. His hands were covered with red splotches, and Piña couldn't hear a single word he was saying. Mark was yelling frantically in Spanish, as his hands hovered over the wounds and checked for any sign of swelling or infection. At first, Piña wanted nothing more than to pull her wing back into shape again. But as the minutes ticked by and there was still no signs of improvement, she grew tired of watching the worry etched on Mark's face. "What's wrong?" she asked. Her voice was scratchy from lack of use, and it sounded a bit hoarse. "Are we going to fix my wing soon?" Piña knew the question was ridiculous, but it felt important to say anyway. Mark jumped slightly at her words and then nodded furiously. "Yeah, I'm going to fix it right now. I'm sorry about everything," he said softly, gently running a hand through her feathers. He started talking softly to her in Spanish, apologizing for putting all those worries and injuries on her shoulders. But once again, Piña could barely understand him. A couple of hours later, the bandages were taken off of Piña's neck, and her wing was put in a new brace. It hurt quite a lot, but she didn't mind. Mark and his mother had managed to fix her wing. Her broken wing was now properly positioned in its socket, and a new brace was placed around her foot, which prevented her from walking or moving too fast or too far. Piña spent most of her days cooped up in bed, sleeping whenever she wanted to and eating the meals that Mark brought to her. Mark visited her daily to check on how she was feeling. Piña was beginning to grow quite fond of Mark. He never took advantage of her, nor did he ever leave her behind. He treated her exactly the way a good big brother should treat his younger siblings, with kindness and love. One morning, however, Mark was called away unexpectedly to take care of some business at work. Piña was sad about Mark being away, and she was feeling lonely and depressed. That afternoon, she started crying. She was sitting in the middle of the living room with her wings curled around her body in an attempt to comfort herself. Her tail hung limply in the air as she laid there motionless. She missed Mark very badly. Suddenly the door opened and Mark appeared, wearing a grin on his face. Piña sat upright as quickly as possible as she recognized the grin that Mark wore every time he came home from work. Mark walked up to her and knelt down in front of her, taking both of her injured wings and inspecting them closely. They look pretty good now. Your wing is fixed and your ankle isn't swollen at all anymore. Mark stood up from his crouched position and smiled at Piña. Piña was feeling very happy. Finally, she could fly freely once again. Mark was just heading towards the bedroom door when Piña started to whimper. He frowned and turned around to look back at her. "Do you want to stay here or do you feel like going outside?" he asked her quietly, holding his hand out to her. Piña thought about the two options that were presented to her. Outside, she responded instantly. Mark grabbed his keys and headed towards the door while asking Piña to wait in the living room. After a couple of minutes, Mark re-entered the room looking excited. Piña jumped up and down on the sofa. "You have to promise me you'll be careful. If you hurt yourself or fall down or do anything that will make you really uncomfortable, you don't have to go out there." Piña nodded enthusiastically, knowing what he meant. She was getting tired again now, so Mark picked her up carefully, wrapping her in his arms, and carried her outside to the balcony. He walked out on the patio and then sat down on the edge of the railing to admire the scenery. There was a tall tree that grew right inside of the fence that surrounded the patio. It stretched upwards to the sky, almost reaching high enough to touch the clouds. There wasn't a single cloud visible above. All Piña could see were trees. Everything was green and peaceful. Even the air smelled different. Piña was glad she couldn't smell any humans around. As she rested her head against Mark's chest, the warm air tickled her cheek. After a couple minutes of enjoying the calmness, Mark stood up from where he had been sitting and walked to where his bike was parked. "Let's ride," he said happily, patting Piña's back. "I think you've earned it." Piña let out a little squeak as she bounced happily on Mark's back. It felt amazing to finally be able to run around and fly. She loved the feeling of riding with Mark, especially since she was the one who usually gave him directions. It was nice to have some freedom. "Come on then," Mark yelled to her as he jumped off the rail, grabbing hold of the handles on his bike, pushing it away from the house and onto the road leading up towards the town. Piña laughed as Mark started pedaling furiously down the road. For the whole trip, Mark sang along to whatever song he was listening to, laughing as he made the silly faces that made Piña laugh so much. They arrived at the town center, where Mark left Piña in a small clearing near the main entrance of the town. Piña watched as he entered the town hall and disappeared from sight. Piña sighed as she leaned back against the trunk of one of the trees. The weather was perfect. Not a single drop of rain had fallen in the past 2 weeks. It wasn't unusual to have a cool autumnal breeze on a hot summer day, and it had always been this way in her village. There was something extremely refreshing about a clear and sunny day. A couple of hours had passed, and Piña was bored out of her mind. What was the point in lying in the grass and watching the clouds pass by if she could hardly move? Piña was contemplating whether or not she should try and stand when she heard someone approaching from the forest. At first she didn't pay attention to anything except the sound of the feet crunching across the dry and soft soil beneath the leaves. But then she noticed the sound coming closer and closer until a young boy emerged from the woods. The boy looked rather nervous, as if he was afraid of something. He was holding a basket in one hand, and his other was clutching tight onto a brown sack tied around his waist. His eyes scanned the area quickly, searching desperately for any sort of human contact. When he noticed none, he slowly approached Piña, and kneeled down directly in front of her. Piña tried to hide underneath the thick branches of her tree, but the boy reached out his free hand and touched her wing. "Hello, my name is Marco. Are you lost?" Marco asked as calmly as he could. Piña froze, and slowly peeked her head out from under the tree. She stared wide-eyed at the young boy. She remembered Mark telling her stories about people who would talk to animals and get friendly, and she wondered if Marco might be one of them. She decided that it wouldn't hurt to trust him, so she slowly slid out from her hiding spot. With her wing fully healed and resting nicely on her back, she began to walk in the direction of Marco. Once they were walking side by side toward a quiet patch of bushes, Marco reached inside the basket and pulled out a bundle wrapped in a dark blue blanket. He unwrapped it and held it in front of Piña, revealing a fluffy white puppy. Piña stared at it for a moment. It looked harmless enough. Marco smiled as he saw Piña start sniffing at the puppy. She stepped forward, sniffing the tiny creature's head gently with her nose, and then gently pecked its ear softly in greeting. Marco grinned again. The puppy was a real beauty. Its fur was pure cream colored, and it had bright amber eyes that sparkled with joy at having someone play with it. Piña nuzzled the puppy affectionately. It was a beautiful, fluffy white dog with a big floppy tongue, and its ears flopped over each side of its face, making it resemble a cute little duck. Piña cuddled the puppy to her chest before nipping it on one of its fuzzy little ears. The puppy giggled happily, licking her chin with its pink tongue. Pinna's heart melted at that. It reminded her of Mark, her other half. "This little guy seems happy today," Marco commented with a smile eventually. After playing with the puppy for 10 minutes, Marco finally took the puppy and placed it back in the basket. Then Marco bid Piña farewell, and walked away. Piña went back to the location where Mark had left her previously, and eventually, Mark came back and took her home. The end.